back and we are ready for Q&A to close us out. So we have some friends here with us coming on in. We have Jake, our hydrating champion. I also have brought my water here to hydrate. We have Chad. We have Shayna. We have Ryan. And we've got a crew here. Amazing. Jumping on right as I call everybody's name. This was coordinated expertly. Okay, so we have our FAQs today. We've got a whole variety of crew here. We've got our designers, we've got our developer, we've got a designer advocate, and we're excited to take all your questions. We have gotten a total, I can't even count this high, basically, the amount of questions we got in the Q&A today. There's still 482 open questions. There's so many questions, and 222, great number, answered already. There's so many questions. We can't get to 400 in the amount of time we have left, but we're going to try and answer some of the most popular ones. And before we get to that, we have a little treat from Jake. Over to you, my friend.
Yo, okay, so I fixed my code from earlier. I just wanted to show you all that it is possible and it works really well. It was actually an example of like configuration getting in the way. I moved some files around and broke my server. But anyways, this is what it looks like, and it's really exciting. And the GIF is of me 20 seconds after I got off the webinar.
Amazing. We're doing it live, people. Cool. So let us get into some questions. First, actually, before we get into the questions, want to let everybody introduce themselves. Just kind of tell us what your role is at Figma. I think most of, or half of us have already been met during this webinar, but I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Lauren. I'm on the designer advocate team, and I am your host of the last part of the webinar. Chad?
Hello, everyone. I'm Chad Bergman. I'm a designer advocate here at Figma as well. That's our Jake.
I'm Jake. I'm a developer advocate. Same team as the advocates, just a little bit more developer-y. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shayna.
I'm Shayna. I'm a product designer here, and I work on our design systems features. So things like variables and components and more. And I'll pass it to Ryan.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I work on our internal design systems team. And so, yeah, super excited to chat.
Awesome. Cool. So let us pop into the file, and we are going to start with Ryan. We had a lot of questions coming in the Q&A on naming when it comes to variables, naming when it comes to your design system. I know everything is different for every company, every team, but would love to hear some of your best practices that you kind of work on when it comes to naming, whether it's your variables or your design system.
Totally. So naming is definitely one of like the hard problems, and it feels like really like exceedingly like simple. For all of our variables, we've tried to set up a rough naming schema, kind of like a taxonomy. So all of our variables have like a similar sort of prefix, color, text, radius, and so forth. And then we'll layer on modifiers for things like secondary, tertiary, et cetera, in a consistent way. And we've really thought a lot about sort of what that structure is, so that as we add variables over time, inevitably, we have like some sort of naming structures that we can grow into as new use cases pop up. So I would definitely start by like sort of thinking about that naming structure, so that you can kind of scale that over time. But for just starting out, I definitely would recommend starting with the sort of smallest set you need, rather than sort of building too far out too quickly. I think from using variables like ourselves, we've definitely like noticed cases that we didn't anticipate and like needed to like sort of extend things in new ways. One last call out is to definitely like build it with the team. And so all of our variables sort of align with code one-to-one. And so we like both like do like, regular like design crits around how we name things, which, doubles as a chance for like the design team to like familiarize themselves with like the system and weigh in on like how things are named. But also similarly with engineering, so that we can kind of make sure that all these terms like make sense to like a broad audience. If you're curious about Figma's specific color system, we've actually published a lot of our color system like online. And so you're welcome to take a look at the specific schema that we use internally.
That's right. And you made a really good call out there of kind of working with your developers. And I'm going to go right over to Jake on this one about naming from your end of things on the developer side.
Yeah, so the question is about like how we name variables and whether or not it needs to match. And something I started pasting screenshots in because we're doing this live. But it's important to align conceptually, right? Like you want to make sure you're using the same naming conventions where possible, especially if you're like talking about a semantic token and a primitive token. And like the things that guide those patterns are, it's good to have that shared, but the specific syntax may change here and there. And like maybe in the code syntax looks a little bit differently. And that's why we have code syntax for variables, right? So like in the variable settings, you can actually supply for web, iOS, and Android a unique custom like formatting of the name of the variable if you want. And then we use that when we refer to it in code. So that's super helpful is, supplying the code syntax inside of Figma, but also the thing that's going to go the furthest for you is actually just kind of using the same names. But we also recognize that that's not always the easiest thing to do.
Awesome. Cool. Right over to, this is going to be a combo one, a Jake and Chad combo. So that we can get, again, both perspectives on this, designer and developer. Best practices for sharing new design system releases. Over to you, Chad, for this one. I know we recently kind of changed the little pop-up that would show up when our system is published. We moved that up into the top right-hand corner, but any other ways that you suggest that people can kind of make their team aware of these system releases? And then we can go over to Jake after that of how to make sure that you're keeping the code snippet up to date when these new releases do come.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question we've talked with the community around as well. One thing I always like to say is, regardless of when you're putting an update out there, it can't come without communication. We don't just blindly publish an update and say, all right, update's done, go, right? It's publishing, it's a communication piece. So, if we're talking about publishing updates in Figma itself, utilizing the update description box when you are publishing, that's really helpful because that's going to go out when teams are accepting those updates. Also, if they are going to look back in version history, you can always see those notes. But other best practices that we've seen from teams, updating a changelog right in their library file, that's a popular approach we've seen. If you go to the Figma community and duplicate any design system library examples from there, there's a handful out there that do that as well. But then there's also the process piece. What does your update process look like? Do you put an email notification out? Do you have a planned day of the week where, let's say, every other Thursday you publish library updates? Do you have a release cadence? What do comms look like around that? Do you publish out an email? Do you send notifications in Slack or Teams or whatever messaging you use? Do you have office hours for your design system that you invite people to and you share updates? Really, all of it goes to say that we can't just hit publish when we put out a new release. There needs to be a level of communication as well.
Awesome. Yeah, the design, the office hours was a huge one. I remember when I was on the design team, that was really helpful in letting people know what was going out. Jake, over to your side of things. How do you keep the code snippets up to date, making sure as these design system releases are going out?
So what I love about this is that it feels like it's a code snippet question, but it's actually a pattern question. So if you're making a change to the structure of your component in Figma that is such that it requires a change to the code snippet you would expect to see rendered for your design system, that's actually not that the snippet needs to be updated. It means that the component in the code base needs to be updated. And that's a flag that, hey, we actually need to kind of like, as a design systems team here, recognize that there's a pattern that's being, applied inside of Figma that is no longer kind of accounted for in the code base. And so the snippet being inaccurate is kind of the canary in the coal mine that you actually need to align and communicate across your teams about like, hey, are we adding a variant right now or are we adding a variant right now? And like, should we be using one of these that already exists? And I know it's not what you want, but like, should we do that? Or do we need to go in and add the style and the new variant to the properties for this component over there? So, communication is kind of how you get through that. And what guides those decisions is ultimately going to be some combination of what you're doing as a company, as a team together, how fast this needs to be rolled out, and like whether or not you are, really strict about, your component property definitions and those sorts of things. So in my mind, that's less of a question about the snippet, which would need to change eventually, and more of a question about, the core component definition in the code base, right? Which is something you do want to know when that's happening. You don't want that to be just like automated necessarily, because it can have impact in the code.
Yeah, communication key. That's what we're always definitely trying to drive home for sure. Awesome. Over to, these are rapid fire today. Over to Shayna. There was a question about, can variables be used across files, or are they local to one? I wonder, do you want to share screen for this one to kind of show folks maybe how to publish?
I could probably get a file set up.
We'll come back to you on this one maybe while
Sure, yeah.
that's set up. Awesome. So yeah, because I think that'll be really helpful to show folks how we can publish and use it across multiple files. So while we're waiting for that, Jake, I'll give you a breath. This one is a really, really good one that came in. And honestly, this one was a question that I had myself. And I made my team really get this one out to me because I was confused on it. So what about typography styles now? Are they still necessary? And I put these 3 questions together because I think one kind of answers another, and they're good to be talked about together. So are they still necessary, these styles? When you create a variable, can you like combine these multiple variables together to create one variable like you could with styles, or is that not a thing? And then how do you define when to use styles versus variables? Chad, over to you for this one.
Yeah, and this is a great question. And I think I even saw it through the chat earlier today, people asking about this as well. Type styles, they definitely still have their place. And it's really the recommended way to distribute your type variables with your library. If we think about a style versus a variable is a single definition. It can have one value for it, and then that value can change based upon its context or its mode, whereas a style can be made up of multiple different definitions. So we can put multiple variables together in a style. If we think about design tokens and the working group spec, there's a thing called a composite design token. That's really what a style is in essence. It's a combination of multiple pieces creating that style. I'm gonna actually do this live here as well. Like, let's just jump into a file here. So if we take a look at, let's say, a library file here, right? And we look at our text styles here, we have this display. And when we take a peek, we see we've already bound variables here. We'll zoom in even a little more there, make it a little easier to see. So we could publish out these variables, and sure, people using the library, they could go in and assign it for the font family. They could assign a line height or a size. But that's a lot of work. Teams have to apply that variable over and over and over. So from a design system and a library standpoint, you can create that and publish it out as a style. So let's just drop in some text here. Hi, framework. And instead of us having to bind all of those now, we can just apply that style. And the style is now backed by the variable. So if we looked at our style here, we can see we have those variables behind it. Same way that you can distribute your effects, your grids, stuff like that. You can bind together the different fields into one style.
Cool. I'm going to take back the old screen share. And Shayna, are you good for a file?
Yeah. So variables are definitely something that you can share across multiple files. And let me find my screen share for a sec. But basically, in any file where you have a couple defined, you can then publish them across multiple files, same as you would with components and other assets. And so if I were to publish, you would see that the entire collection is shown here. And then these would get published either to everyone in your organization or everyone in your team. And so if I publish these, they'll be available for broader use in other files. But then, of course, you can always use them locally as well.
Awesome. And do you want to talk to hiding some of them too, similarly to how we can do styles?
Yeah. So basically, like you'll be able to create your variables in this window, and then in publishing, you can right click and basically decide to hide collections if you'd like to. And so one reason you might want to do this is if you have like a collection for a bunch of atomic colors that are named like red 100, red 200, and those are helpful to create aliases and create semantic colors for your design system, but maybe you don't want the rest of your team to use all those. You can hide that collection from publishing. And so when you do that, basically what it'll mean is that it will no longer show up in the list of things you can publish. And so instead of being like checked by default every time, it'll kind of ignore it. And so hiding is something you can reverse also by right-clicking in this window. And you can go ahead and use show when publishing to go ahead and publish that as well.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Cool. Going back to Jake. Let's see.
Yo,
My friend Jake.
my friend.
There's my pal, my friend. A lot of questions on code.
This is all the same question. Yeah. The answer is yes. I mean, like today we've got Swift UI going, but you know, Jetpack Compose we're working on, and then like Angular. Like I saw so much love for Vue, so much love for Angular in the chat. I couldn't see it while I was talking earlier. Thank you. And then also the love for web components. I was so happy to see that as well. That, yes, like that's what we're working on. That's what we want. Create an issue on the repository, please, and get it upvoted, because, you know, we'd love to support all of this stuff. So yeah. The answer is yes, we're going to. Today, it's currently Swift UI, and React and Storybook, if you have Storybook.
Cool. All right, let's see. Just looking through.
So much Angular love. So good to see.
Everybody loves Angular.
The first framework I ever used was the first version of Angular, like forever ago, with ng bind and all of that stuff.
Love it. I want to get one over to Ryan again. This one, and Ryan, feel free to pass this one along too, because I'm not even sure that I know the answer to this one. So, struggling with applying the semantic layer to typography variables. I understand the primitives, but bringing it all together right now is very counterintuitive. Can you explain that a little bit for folks?
Yeah. And so for us, we have broken down our type scale into like, we have like headings versus body versus like display text, and then a bunch of permutations from there. We don't actually use different modes in terms of like our text is always presented in like the same way. But for consumption, we do bundle these all into styles. That is what the majority of designers use, but then break out individual properties into type variables. Actually, Shada, was there anything that you wanted to add to how we've been using like type variables?
Yeah, we use them internally and we bind them inside all our text styles for the team to use. And so the team can still use the text styles like they're familiar with, which is great. And we've like named them to be at parity with kind of what we use in code too. So we've worked with like our internal engineering team to roll that out as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm very excited about the typography updates. I think we're all just as excited as everybody else who was asking for them. Cool. I'm gonna go right over to chat on this one. We have brands that use solid versus gradient styles for a single token. How do we define these in tokens?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is another example where styles are really going to be the best implementation here for how you distribute that. So thinking about when we create a gradient, and if we are binding variables to different color stops in that gradient, for brands that need to swap those out and have those gradient colors update, you would apply the style, and people would then consume the style, apply it, whether it's a background, whether it's an illustration, wherever it's applied. But then when you are setting those values, so if you have a mode for another brand where it's just a solid fill, you would just set the value of those variables. Back in the beginning, if anyone's here for that keynote, when Shayna did a demo on like gradient start, mid, stop, and it was a different color for each, in your mode or your brand that would be solid, you would just specify that same hex color in that mode. So then if switching into that mode, it would just be solid all the way through it.
Awesome. I'm gonna go over to Jake on this one. API. The API.
I've heard of such a thing.
Have you heard of the API? How will things work with the API now, since styles will potentially depend on information coming from the variables endpoint?
Okay, I'm assuming this is talking about our REST API. So for those that don't know, we have a plugin API, a widget API, a REST API. REST API is a bunch of different things, and within that is a variables API on the enterprise tier that allows you to read and create tokens for an entire variables like library, right? And so it can do it at that high level. So the question is that since those are being bound to styles, is there going to be a conflict then? What happens like if I make a REST API request to get a rectangle that has a style applied to it that uses variables? And the answer is the same way that it would happen if you had a solid color that was bound to a variable. And what that is bound variables. It's this concept of a variable being applied to a fill in our API. For the non-developers, it's just like we basically say, oh, this rectangle has this variable bound to it for its fill, right? It also tells you what the hex color is, like ultimately, but that link to a variable, that still is going to show up when you say, what is the fill of this rectangle? And it's a gradient style, for example, or a fill style that has a gradient on it. You still get access to that information that there's a variable bound there. The big like REST API library stuff that's like, what's the entire library's token values and all these sorts of things, that thing is still in the variables REST API. But in terms of just like knowing what variables are being used in a file, you still have access to all of that. And you know, for the current mode, what the value actually is in that moment for that file and all of that. So hopefully that clarifies. Hopefully it wasn't too technical for voice only.
Love it. I'm going to go to Shayna for
Hydrate.
this. Oh, hydrate. Everybody pause and hydrate. Quick.
Lainey was on top of it in the chat.
Hydrated. Thank you, Lainey. This one is just a funny sentence to me because variable fonts support variable fonts are different than fonts for variables, and that's confusing because we are confused now. So, Shayna, do I can't even say the sentence. Do variable fonts support variables? And then they were describing more like font weight supporting arbitrary numbers. Can you talk to us about variable fonts different than variables for fonts?
Yeah, so some context variable fonts are basically a different way to package fonts where you get access to like a sliding scale of values instead of just like specific instances. So instead of just being able to pick regular and bold because that's all the font maker like packaged for you, you'll be able to input a number between like 0 and 1000. And then it doesn't have to be an exact 400 or 500 value. It could be something like 453 and it would still render at some boldness in between that. And variable fonts come with various axes like font weight, but also like sometimes they go between regular and like Latin and italic, Roman and italic and things like that. And those have been out for a while, are definitely being adopted across the industry. Today, we don't have the support, but it's something we're actively working on. And so you'll continue to see more updates trickle out even after today. And so you will definitely be able to bind numbers to font weight. And so that means you could create a number variable, and then that number variable could be something like 600, 670. You'd be able to bind it to the font layer, and then it would show that weight, or like it would show whatever axis, variable font axis it refers to. So that's definitely coming, and we're excited to get that out to you guys.
Awesome. Yeah, if there's one thing that I've learned at Figma, it is the team is constantly iterating and iterating, and they're never stopped working on these types of things. So there's still more amazing things to come. And next one, I am going to go to you, Chad, to see any best practices. I know there's some plugins, but would love to hear your thoughts on best practices for transitioning from color styles to variables, because we know a ton of people are doing that right now.
Yeah. And I see this one here, and this becomes a big, hairy, scary question, right? 1,000+ components, right? I think a sub question I would have here is, of those 1,000+ components, are they utilizing 1,000+ colors as well, or is it kind of the same primitive color set there? Alas, though, the starting process is really the same, where doing that transition from styles to variables, you can, similar to how I was showing before, how you back your typography styles with variables for, font, the font family, for font weight, etc. You can do the same thing for color. So you can have all of your existing color styles that you have in your library today. And then as you're building out your variables for, whether you're doing your primitives and then your semantic colors, you can back those styles with the semantic variables, publish that out, and then you're still using styles. Your components are still consuming styles. Teams that are using those components, they're getting that update. All it's changed is behind the scenes, it's linked to a variable instead of a raw hex value. Then in the future, when you do another release, you can detach those styles if you want to be just purely bound to variables, or you can leave it as styles. It kind of comes into a, hey, what works best for your team at that point? I did a little walkthrough on this. If you go to the Figma YouTube channel and look at the Figma tips playlist, our advocacy team, we're always putting out short little tips there. This was one that we did put out an example of what this looks like.
Awesome. Super helpful. Yeah, I know that's been in some of the calls that we have as designer advocates, that's been one of the biggest question that's come up. Cool. This one I think is a fun one, maybe for everybody. I think I might start with Shayna on this one, but we know it's taken a minute for us to get out typography variables. So obviously there was a couple of challenges with that. It would be awesome for people just to kind of hear, like, are there any challenges that you found while doing this? Was it UI stuff for our designers on the call who were making the designs of it? Was it technical stuff? Anything that you found kind of challenging in this whole process of getting these the typography variables, or any maybe like Code Connect for Jake too out?
Yeah, this one's definitely like a huge project, and shout out to our engineering team who's been working a ton on this. I think like fonts in general are like super crazy, like the world of fonts, like everything that's possible. Like partly is because like when you create a font, there's like some things that are industry standards, but then sometimes they're not really like codified and guaranteed across all fonts. And so whenever we do a project that involves fonts, there's like a lot of cases we have to consider. And for variables as well, basically like any new field that we want to support with variables, we have to do the manual work to integrate it into Figma and support it and make sure it plays nicely with everything else in Figma, because everything is so systemically connected. And so with typography, that means like, we not only have to think about missing fonts and things, we have to think about styles. We have to think about how it works with everything else when you edit something on Canvas. And so because we are offering both the layer of like, you get to create all these variables and store them in your files, but also they have to work in Figma along with everything else we already have. They have to work with components and instances and prototyping, etc., dev mode support, make sure you can inspect them. There's just like a lot we have to cover. And so that can often be different than I think a lot of third-party tools that like partner companies and other companies that build tools on top of Figma. Often they only have to worry about the layer of like defining all these things and storing them, but they don't have that entire canvas that we have and everything you can do with it. And so there's definitely a lot of complexity that we want to make sure we work through and get right. There's often a lot of cases that we have to like test and make sure we like go through it all. And so that is because we're working on it. We hear you and we want to get it out to you as soon as possible. And there's more to come too, as I said, of like we have the launch today, and there will be like a couple other features that will be trickling out as well, like kind of fast follow features. So that includes what I just mentioned in terms of like supporting variable fonts, and things like scoping also will be coming too.
Awesome. Anybody else want to kind of add any challenges that they found? I know Shanna covered a ton. It's okay. We don't have to. Great. Cool. Awesome. Let's see. Let's go to chat. I'm gonna go to you on this one. Not sure if we've covered this a little bit already, but somebody asked, we have brands that use solid versus gradient styles for a single token. How do we define these in tokens?
Yeah, we actually did cover this one before. So TLDR, specify your same value across each of those stops in the different modes there.
Perfect. Awesome. Let's see. I'm scouring my questions to see what else we got. If folks have more questions, definitely throw them in the Q&A. Let's see. I think there was a question for Jake on handling designer overrides, other than obviously the communication we talked about at the beginning. Any suggestions on here?
Yeah, I think that there's two ways to tackle this, right? So one type of override is a quote unquote proper override, like something that's called an override in Figma, where let's say you're just like changing the color of something that was typically modified with a variant, right? That kind of an override is interesting because a lot of times that isn't actually visible in like the props interface. Like in terms of like props changing, it's kind of like, oh, success is now lime green instead of whatever green was, right? And that implies a change that has to happen at the design systems level in code, not the instance level, right? Not the developer who's implementing an instance of the component. That has to go up the chain to whoever's building the components in the code base, because they have to go, change something. It should also go up the chain internally in your design systems team if someone's overriding these sorts of colors as well, right? And there needs to be a conversation about, well, why are we doing this? And like, do we need to capture this in our patterns? What's going on? For that scenario, right? In addition to just like, don't do it unless you really have to. And if you do, please talk to people about it. We have the ability to detect kind of like changes like that, where you can compare to the main component when there's overrides. We can also, if you detach, we can compare to the main, like the component it was detached from as well. And detaching is another way that this works or happens. Today, Code Connect will not run on a component that's been detached and is just a frame, because too many things can, be wrong there. But again, this kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like, you're talking about making a change that is breaking a link between what's in code and what's in design. So if you hand that thing off to your engineer, they're not going to be able to implement it using the component library. Or if they try to, it's going to maybe not look the same because you detached it, you changed the style of it, and that hasn't been reflected in code yet. So in my mind, these are the things where it's like, these are the scenarios where you need to be like, what are we doing, family? Like, are we building this together? Are we not building it together? And if we are making these one-off overrides, are we doing it in a way that can be treated as one-off? So there's a bunch of alarm bells around it, like, hey, we're writing some inline style to override the way that this looks because X, Y, and Z, like we decided that this needs to happen. Or do we need to be having a conversation that says, hey, we want to push the brand forward, so we want to change some colors here. Dear design is do this, and like, what would it look like to do that and evolve this component to like handle these new needs, right? So it's one of those things where it's like, it's not inherently wrong. Like the desire to change and modify your design system and make it consumer, like appealing to consumers and stay ahead of the curve, whatever it is, those intentions aren't wrong. But if you're going to use the design system, commit to being in a design system, which is like, how do we account for that in our patterns, And that means changes in design and changes in code, Hopefully that's a way to answer what would happen technically, but then also here's how to think about it broadly.
Awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. I have another question. I just saw it, so I haven't even typed it in here yet, but I'm gonna throw this one over to Chad. Of basically, when do you suggest kind of doing multiple collections within a file versus doing collections in different files for your variables? It seems like a lot of folks are working with different brands. When's it better to kind of have like multiple different files versus having those all in different collections in one file? Any suggestions on that? It's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one, right? And I
Yes,
think
I feel like.
I think this is our favorite two words as designers, right? It depends.
Depends.
There's really not a right or wrong way to do it. It does come down to experimenting and finding really what works best for your team. One of the great things that we get to do is work with so many of you in the community and see how you're approaching these things. And what I can say I've personally seen from talking with a lot of folks is that collections tend to be grouped more just by, hey, describing what they are. Like dimensions are all together in one. They might have all their colors together in one. Maybe now with typography, they might be together in one collection. I think it makes sense for those to all live together in the same file. But then there's a question of, okay, do you have that living separate from your components? If we go back and think about styles, a common approach that we'd see people take with styles is you might have a foundational style library that gets published out, and then those styles get used inside of components in a separate file. With variables in different collections, though, we tend to see more of that living in the same file with the component. So things that are primitives that maybe you don't want exposed out, those you could have them live together in the same file, and you could just scope those to not show. You could hide those from publishing. Or if you, let's say, do have multiple different brands, or you just want that clear line of separation, you could create a separate file that has just primitive variables in it. Publish that file for your DS team to be able to then use those and alias them as semantics. That said, again, it depends, right? What's going to work best for your team there? Does it work best to just put them all together in the one file? Do you want that separation? It really does come down to experimenting on there. There's not a wrong way or a right way.
There's a question that came in specifically for Jake. Let me.
Oh.
It says, and I haven't even got another one. They're coming in rapid, and I haven't even put them in the deck yet. Question for Jake: what do you think of abstract components similar to coding? More specifically, core or base components with basic properties that can be reused. Oh, base components. I know we have thoughts on that from a design.
I think, okay, to set the scene for folks, base components are kind of like irreplaceable in code. They're super helpful. Earlier in my demo, I showed like a button and an icon button. The component code for those two things is actually mostly shared in something I call button base. And that's a pattern that like lots of different libraries use. MUI's got its own, Material UI's got its own version. Everyone kind of thinks differently. And the reason that these base components exist is because there's a whole bunch of non-visual stuff, especially that like functional property, behavioral things that like are very annoying to write for every single kind of component, right? And so you try to reuse as much of that code as possible. And this isn't exclusive to design systems. This is just how engineers think. Like engineers are like, oh, that's a pattern. Oh, that's a pattern. And they start to encapsulate this stuff so that it can be inherited and extended to as many things as possible. So we do the same thing in design systems, right? Where we're like, here's a base component to handle all the touch interactivity, to handle all of the things like, oh, an on-click is required. And like, oh, ARIA label is a property we want to make sure is available to us here. And, there are all these little things that if there's one place where that's all kind of being defined, then you can apply it to a bunch of different things and inherit it in a very nice way. Now, in a design file, like we don't really think of it necessarily the same way. Like there are moments where you're like, wow, it'd be great if I could kind of like extend certain things in this way, like at the component level. But like a design of a button is kind of like all of these permutations. Variants help, component properties help, but it's like all of these permutations of all these things that kind of need to all be spelled out. Like there's no CSS inside of like Figma where you kind of have this cascade that kind of overrides and inherit. Like we don't have that functionality, right? Because designers are like, no, it needs to be exactly this, and this needs to be exactly this, and then you kind of apply your patterns on top of all of that. For that reason, we get into a scenario where base components, concept in code, base components, not as usable in Figma, right? And, you know, honestly, as an engineer, I'm just going to like allow y'all to talk about whether or not base components should be in design files, because I think that that's a whole contentious conversation to have. But someone might say that those need to be exactly the same, right? I don't think they do. And I think things like Code Connect allow us to account for those discrepancies by saying, hey, all of these things translate to, you know, like we were showing earlier, one component in Figma can be 7 different components in code, and we have the ability to actually do those translations through something like Code Connect. So the answer to the question is, I think base components are invaluable in code, but not just for like visual UI reasons, right? Like for many other reasons. And it's just a core part of what it's like to program as humans that need to be able to modify code over time and read someone else's code and that sort of a thing. So I love base components, but I don't necessarily expect the same behavior in Figma.
Do either Ryan, Chad, Shayna, do either of y'all want to talk to base components in Figma?
Yeah,
Chad's
I mean,
smiling.
Yeah.
as someone who, you know, used to work in code and familiar with the concept there, and then you know, bringing it into Figma, you know, it used to be a way of, you know, we used to recommend that in Figma, but you know, as one thing I want to call it that Jake said there, right? Like it's invaluable in code, but would he necessarily approach it the same way in Figma? And there was a time when, yes, we did recommend doing that. But as things continue to evolve, you know, introduction of variants, the introduction of component properties, the introduction of multi-edit, really what we're finding is that creating a base component of all permutations in Figma, you know, it's not necessary anymore. Yes, as a maintainer and someone who's been a maintainer, it makes it easy for me to update. But now with multi-edit or by using props and being able to select everything, I can edit just as easy, but also make a better consumption experience for those who are using the components. You also get into states where, you know, you're really using those Figma features to just show and hide things. So every time someone is bringing in a component that has all those hidden layers in there, you know, that's going to affect performance of the component. It's going to make their file jump up. I know we talked about this at, I think it was Config 2022, where we talked about, you know, a variant set of 7,000 some input variants, right? Well, that's obviously a very, very heavy set of components there. But being able to just scale them back down, you know, optimize for consumption, you know, base components really aren't the way of doing that. And, you know, I've seen more and more teams really move away from that. As someone who had implemented base components myself, I had moved away from that a couple of years ago as well. It really just makes a better consumption experience by not using that base component. And I will probably kick this Ryan as well. I know as someone who has maintained and works on components, right? Like I'd rather put more work on myself as a maintainer than on consumers of the libraries. So Ryan, I don't know if you have thoughts as well, just from, you know, the maintainer side of things.
Yeah, I mean, sort of echoing sort of like what you've been saying, for Figma internally, we definitely use like a flat set of components. And so we sort of separate out like you know, our like core components like a button or an input, you know, are handling all of these permutations by variants, and we're using features like multi-edit to like manage a lot of those. And then in the sort of like larger views, we like sort of strongly differentiate those as like these are definitely like sticker sheets where we'll expose like nested like props, but they're more kind of assembled views of things. And so we don't treat them in like the same way that we would like a sort of like a sort of like a core component, like within the system itself. And so if you were to open up, one of our files, you would just sort of see like a flat list of like our top level components, each that has like a sort of entirely self-contained component, with all of our like variants sort of organized in that one sort of thing.
I'd also just add, like, just because we say the name base components and it means roughly the same thing in both places, it doesn't mean that we'd create the same base components. Like a base component, historically, what the task that it was performing in Figma is very different than what it would be performing in code. I think this is one of those scenarios where we have like a lot of the same language, but often and it means roughly the same thing, but doesn't have the same implementation. Is like a whole nother complexity there on top of all that.
That's all them.
Taking a light turn away from the base components, somebody asked in the chat, are there any good examples of implementing spacing tokens? I know it's always good to remember that like everybody has kind of different levels of familiarity with this and stuff, and it's always so helpful to hear from folks who are used to, like, are very familiar with all of these things and kind of how they're doing it. I'd love to hear maybe from Ryan and Shayna, and then maybe Chad and Jake will go all the way around. How are you implementing spacing tokens? Is it with paddings, margin gaps, any other places that we're not thinking of?
Yeah, so for Figma, we have like just started introducing spacing tokens. We essentially like are trying to like bind things to the sort of multiples of 4 and 8 that like everything is sort of like designed around. And so we're primarily using them for, like spacing, margin, and padding, but we're not differentiating between like those different categories. We do have like implicit rules for like the design team of, like this is sort of like what, kind of like how we organize like something in like a property panel. But we're generally sort of like making those bindings ourselves in like the design system. And then when people go out and like use those, then they sort of will hopefully get those sort of like auto layout properties like by default. But we're still in pretty early days ourselves of sort of using it within our own system. Shin or Chad?
Yeah, Ryan is definitely the expert here on like rolling it out to an internal design system. One thing that is helpful though is that you can also scope all your numbers so that they would only show up for like auto layout gap. Or if you have a variable that's only supposed to be meant for radius and it's specifically named that, in the authoring window for variables, you can right click on any number row, and then you can click edit variable. And there's basically a panel where you can decide where that shows up. And so that can help make it easier so that like the right variables will just show up for the right fields, and like they don't show up in places where they're not supposed to be used.
Yeah, go ahead, Chad.
I was just gonna say, plus one to what Shayna was saying there, right? It's the scoping is really, really helpful. And even seeing teams that are starting to implement some of their spacing tokens on Figma side, sometimes it's that t-shirt sizing. We're seeing people that will alias like a 100 to 1,000 ramp. Got to throw out the it depends, right? But the scoping is a piece that's really, really helpful there. So, as Shane was mentioning, you can also group. So we could view all of our measurements here, and we can see we're aliasing just a very generic unit value right here. And we're saying, our margins, we might apply these to an auto layout gap. If I look here, yeah, we have this just scoped right now. So we'll only see these margin variables when we're working with auto layout, and it can be bound to gap there. With our borders as an example, again, we're using just that kind of primitive unit here, and our border small, it's only going to show up if we're looking at strokes. So being able to scope it is really, really helpful in starting to put those variables into play.
And actually with scoping, there was a couple of questions I saw come in of, can we scope typography? Can we scope typography variables yet, or is that a no?
Yeah, it's coming. So we're working on it, and it'll definitely be out soon.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, let's see. I feel like that might be a good stopping point. Are there any other questions like that y'all, my panelists, have been burning for somebody to ask you that you just have been dying to get the answer out to? Is there anything that you all want to share with folks about anything design system related, anything token, variable, API, Jake, anything related to that you have wanting to get out to the world?
I'm really stoked to see so many folks talking about other web frameworks when we're talking about Code Connect. Really excited to kind of extend what we're supporting there. I'm very passionate about this. I built 2 plugins to do this because I really care about it. And so it's really cool to see these other frameworks kind of like getting some call outs here on top of React and everything. So that's not really an answer to a question. That's just a Jake enthusiasm.
We'll take it.
I think one for me that I've seen it asked a few times where just around, how can I look at, any best practices or other teams that may have approached this? I can't stress enough figma.com/community and taking a look at, duplicating some of the library files that are out there and shared. Atlassian, the Atlassian design system shared out there. Polaris is out there. I know those both have some variables used within them, whether that is from spacing to colors. Those are really good ones. Also, if you just check out designsystems.com, there's lots of articles on there which highlight different approaches. There's also links to open design systems in the Figma community where you can take a look at, hey, how are others approaching their variable setup? How are they approaching component setup? So I know there wasn't a direct question in this today, but I think those are really good resources to share with everyone just because, it can help to learn from seeing. And, there's so many creators putting so many fantastic resources out there. Definitely duplicate and learn from what others are doing.
Yeah, even myself, I use the designsystems.com almost on the daily to check out other people's design systems, just see what they're doing, how they're naming, kind of going back to our original question to Ryan of how do you do naming, seeing how other people are naming, how they're setting up their systems. I use it a ton for like prototyping stuff with variables too, just to see how people have set things up. It's just really inspiring and just really helpful to see how other people are doing it. And it's all open source. So why the heck not? Awesome. Any last minute stuff, Shayna, Ryan? Are all good? I will share my screen if not, and we will do Figma, and we will let everybody know that if you were just have not gotten enough and you want to watch this at a different hour, we have our crew in Singapore is doing another framework special. You can check out scan this QR code and watch that because we know that a lot of stuff is for our Singapore folks and everyone around that area. They are probably asleep right now. I believe it is like 4 a.m. for them. So we didn't expect them to stay up for this, but we're going to do another event for them on April 18th. And then another one in Japan on the 23rd. So if you're looking for more content and or if you were asleep and catching the recording of this, check out those ones so that you can watch that. And this has been Framework by Figma. We've learned so much. I've learned so much. I watched this whole thing to try and catch up on all of the stuff that was coming out. Chad, recap for us. What did we do? There was so much.
Yeah, it was an exciting day, right? Like I think the big thing, right? Variables are coming out of GA today. Of course, typography, variables, and gradients. Huge. I'm excited for those. Having played with those for a bit here. Like, I'm really excited about the potential and what that unlocks for teams.
Mm-hmm. And then there was Jake. Recap for us what came out with Code Connect.
Code Connect is the best way to document your design system with code snippets inside of Figma that are sourced from your code base. So they're the actual thing. So you know that they're accurate. Really exciting. I've been waiting for this forever.
He has. He's excited. We're all excited. So much awesome stuff came out today. It's going to change your lives. I can guarantee it. Okay, I can't guarantee it, but I know it will. I know it will. But no more ask and win typography variables. They are here, my friends. They are here. And as we said too, Figma is constantly iterating on things. I'm sure there is more amazing stuff to come. Check out those 2 more events in Singapore, Japan. Those will be live streamed. And just thank you all for coming with us today. This was really awesome to have. I don't think we've quite done something like this in a long time, a long live stream with a lot of really great stuff. And if you're looking for more stuff, come to Config. See us virtually at Config, see us in person at Config. And thanks for joining us all.